Well, I wanted to thank the organizers and everyone who's present for having me. I'm an assistant professor in ethics of technology, and I've been involved in iGEM more intensely since 2016, but I had my first iGEM experience in 2013. Yeah, I'm really impressed every year with your creativity. And I was telling Jelle and his colleagues before everyone arrived that HP is evolving as the competition is evolving. So we're hoping for better and better HP projects every year because it's a competition. So it's about challenging yourself and doing the best you can. So the first thing I wanted to, voila. This is a bit the outline of today. Why human practices, how human practices, what human practices, and then your questions. So the first why, and that's a text I took from the website on human practices, is that human practices activities require you to think critically and to be able to appreciate different views and to co-develop solutions that best serve the concerned communities. So thinking critically, appreciating different views, and co-developing, you can see this as 3 sets of skills that the competition invites you to develop that are outside of your disciplinary expertise. So I don't know if there are any participants today who have a social science or political science or psychology or humanities background or economics or law. If yes, you can raise your hand. If no, you have to see this that, okay, the competition invites you to develop skills kind of in that sphere. So it's an opportunity. And it's also because when you participate in the competition, you become an ambassador for synthetic biology. And the iGEM as an organization really wants to show what synthetic biology can do for the world. And when you do that, you need to think about the different stakeholders involved. So when I say stakeholders, does everybody understand what I mean? If not, just drop a line. But it's people who are concerned directly or indirectly. And it's not only people, it can also be animals or nature or things that are not necessarily, that don't necessarily have a voice. And the goal of developing these skills and applying them is also to create opportunities for broader publics. And I highlighted the S in publics because it has to do with these different stakeholders. So it's not like there's a public as a whole. It's really something you can be specific about to help shape the practice of synthetic biology. So you can do everything with synthetic biology. You can imagine everything. And the question is, where do we really see that synthetic biology can make a positive impact to the world? And how can we focus on these things? Because it's not about just doing synthetic biology, it's about doing it for good. So before you start engaging in IHP activities, or while, because I guess at this point you've already started to some extent, it's good to ask yourself why your project needs human practices. So what is the problem that you're addressing? And I think most of you have done that, you know, you have your problem formulation. And how does your project help in that problem? So I'm sure this is also something that you've done. So we are developing this thing and it's good for that problem because either there's nothing that helps or what's helping at the moment is not good enough or it has bad side effects. And then the question is, who does your project help? So for whom are you doing it? And you can go on asking questions like that. And these are questions that, of course, you ask at the beginning, but as your project evolves, you might want to ask these questions again at different points to see, okay, are we still addressing the problem, or maybe has our problem changed a little bit? And I think a pitfall that you see sometimes is starting your HP work, wanting people to understand that you have a good idea. And instead, what you should do is start your HP investigations to understand how specific stakeholders can help you make your idea better. So when I say that you are ambassadors for synthetic biology, it's also that, you know, when we have an idea, often we don't understand the extent of a situation, the extent of a problem. And that's why we need to talk to people, because we need to do these iterative processes to understand what it is that we're actually doing, how are we actually making a difference, and how does our contribution fit in. So this is on the HP website. This is the HP cycle. And of course, it's one cycle, but you can see that at every point you would have iterations. You might go back and continue, or you might come back to earlier steps and continue. But the two most important, or the three most important points, is to document everything you do, to think about getting out of the lab. So I think what I've seen in my experience is that a lot of HP projects, teams start with asking other experts in the field, in their field, or in the technical field that they're looking at. And a good way to check with you if you're getting out of the lab, ask yourself, am I still talking to someone at university, or am I really out of the lab? Am I talking to someone who works in a company, who works in a refinery, who works, I don't know, in a field, like to really think about what it means to get out of the lab. And the most important thing is to adapt your project. So every time you go out of the lab, you want to learn something. And this thing you will learn, it can adapt your project at different places. It can adapt your problem that you're asking, like what is it, when you learn more, what is it that you're actually asking? You can adapt your design requirements in your project. So if you see, for instance, safety issues that you hadn't thought about, you can think about them. And all these things, you can see them either at the design of your device, in the microorganism, or in the way the device is presented, or in the rules around who gets to use that device. And for me, a very nice example of that was in 2015, the Edinburgh team, they developed a biosensor for purity of drugs. And they got into very uncomfortable discussions about, okay, but if we do that, aren't we just facilitating drug use? And they had to go and think about their problem setting, what they were trying to do, how they wanted to do it. And I think they did a very brave work to see, okay, what is it that they're addressing? How can they address it in a constructive way? And who are they going to make a difference for? So I also really encourage you to look for examples of teams where you think, whoa, I really liked what they did in human practices, and then try to go beyond that to push to push whatever you think you can contribute. So now the how. Well, we talked about documenting, reflecting, and I think one important aspect of the reflection is to involve the whole team, because often you'll have a human practice manager and you'll have a few people who will be more active with human practices. But sometimes if you say, hey, we went there and we learned this and that, and then someone from Dry Lab will say, oh, well, maybe this has some implications for the way I'm modeling things. For instance, I think in 2018, the Delft team, they had this testing device for gene doping. And when you learn about how athletes do doping, then you can learn about, oh, how should I then model how this doping happens? What am I actually looking for? And how can that be integrated? So that's one example of that. So involve the whole team in your findings and think together about what that teaches you. Then another point is to be specific. The more specific you get, the more relevant your findings will be. So if you do a survey and you come out with people think synthetic biology is good, that's cool. But what does it bring your project? Does it mean exactly, oh, so my project will have no problem once it's finished? Not necessarily. So you have to be, the more specific you are, the more relevant your findings will be. And one pitfall is this broadness. So, you know, if you look for what the public thinks, you have to think, of course it's something you can do, but you have to think, who are you addressing? Who is your public? Who are you missing? Because often if you send surveys, it'll be answered by your friends and family, and it might not be the most representative survey. So how do you get that representativeness? And if you don't have it, how do you address it? So what other methods can help you fill in the gaps? So that's a really important part, methods. And I would say before choosing your method, make sure that you've thought of your questions. So what is it, before you put all that effort into building a survey or building a focus group, what is it that you're looking for? And when you do that, what you're asking is, does the method allow you to answer your questions? So if you have a question about perception, is a broad survey that maybe would only include people you know be the most efficient? Or maybe a small focus group with 10 people you don't know can give you maybe less statistically relevant insight, but more in-depth insight on some certain issues. And don't forget to close the loop. So that's the adapt point, and that's the most important point. What did you learn from these people that can help make your project better? So I'm going to talk about doing interviews, doing surveys, and desk research very briefly, and then we're going to go into questions. I also just mentioned focus groups, so there's really a range of methodologies that you can use to do human practices. And today I'm just going to talk about these 3 ones, but you can find many things that you can do, and that's also needs a little bit of research that requires also talking to a supervisor that can help you. So some tips for doing interviews. The first thing is you have to check with your institution's Human Research Ethics Committee. Sometimes it's called Institutional Review Board or things like that. There's different names in different countries. But as soon as you gather personal information, you need to have some sort of consent or a process that ensures that you're dealing with that information correctly. So check what the requirements are. It might require you to have a consent form depending on what information you're collecting. The information can be just, name, contact details. It can also be personal views on a sensitive topic. So I encourage you to start that process early. And when you have this and you contact people, manage expectations. So, you say, you send an email to someone, you reach out and you say, okay, I am investigating this topic. Our interview will be for half an hour or 45 minutes. And it will be recorded, but only if you agree, and then, attach the form of consent and things like that to have a very clear situation of communication. And think about the fact that when you interview people, you want to learn things that you can't learn otherwise. So be prepared, do your research. So if you go into an interview asking things that are very obviously on a website, the interviewee, you're basically losing precious time with your interviewee. So think about being prepared, and it's okay if you're prepared and there are things you don't understand, because then you can say, hey, I read on your website that there's this and this, but I don't understand. Can you walk me through it? And then even though you ask for information that's already there, you will have another layer of interpretation through your interviewee. Also, it's also good to ask people what are their roles, just to understand a little bit where they're situated and how they understand what they do. So for instance, you might interview someone who's managing director of something, but what does it mean really in a day-to-day life to do that? And when you prepare your interview, so when you think about what you need to know and when you have read the website and documents available, make a guide. So make a list of issues, questions you want to address, but also don't close your mind to the fact that that's a conversation and that maybe the interviewee will say something that you hadn't expected that can be interested to follow up on. And then if you have half an hour, 45 minutes or 1 hour, you have to make a choice on the spot and think, well, maybe this is more interesting for my project than what I thought I had in my questions. So there's really opportunities to be surprised during an interview. And you can learn a lot. Then there's surveys. Again, check with your institution's Human Research Ethics Committee. Maybe you need to add a few lines about consent and data management, what happens with this data, how it will be treated, where it will be stored, etc. And then besides that, think about what statistical methods you're going to use and how these methods fit your research question. And then think back to, okay, what does it mean for my survey? So certain statistical methods require a very large number of participants. If you have a very large number of participants, that means a lot of work for you to contact people and to get them to participate in your survey. So these are really, things you can check with an expert in statistics, like what are your questions, what are the methods that can help you answer that, analyze the answers for that question, and then how do you build your survey and how many people do you need to reach? And then again, when you present the survey, manage expectations. So this survey will take so many minutes, just to give people, so people know what they're getting into. And try the survey yourself many times before sending it out, because there's always things that bug. And usually if things don't work or are not clear, people will drop out of the survey midway. And make it clear also why you're doing this, because the survey is a lot of work. So why are you doing it? How does it relate to the questions of your project at the first part, right? What we were talking about, what do you want to learn from people to make your project better? And then there's doing desk research. And I think in times of pandemics where it's maybe hard to do site visits or in-person discussions, or maybe hard to reach people because everyone's overworked, desk research is also a very good alternative, right? Because you're becoming mini experts on one topic of your device. But the problem that you're addressing is probably not an entirely new problem that no one has thought about before from a humanities, social science, political science perspective. So you can definitely dig in the literature and do a desk research. And actually, when you do interviews, you'll have to do a certain amount of desk research. When you do a survey, you'll have to do desk research. So this is part of doing research in non-technical, non-scientific environment. And then like for everything, what are you looking for? And also try to situate your question. Is it an ethical question? Is it a social scientific question? Is it a behavioral science question or psychology? Is it a political science question? Is it a history question? Try to narrow it down, to give yourself, okay, I'm asking, should we do this or that? Then it's an ethical question. Or I'm asking, what are the mechanisms of adoption of this and this? Then that's more a social science question. So you have to see how you ask your question, which field you're going to need to help you. And if no one in your team has that expertise, seek out a supervisor at your university. See, okay, who's doing something linked to, it won't be necessarily linked to synthetic biology, but it might be linked to a problem about behavior. It might be linked about a problem of a perception or about ethical acceptability of something. And then in the end, when you do that for the formatting, I would say you choose a writing style and a citation style. And this is something you can find lots of guides on. What's important in the presentation is the consistency. And then you can think of doing an academic style of writing or a journalistic type, or you could even think of creative writing. So I know in past years, people have made fake blog posts or little pieces of theater discussions to highlight an ethical issue. And you can also have it as a personal / a team reflection. You know, what do you do with all these things you learn from your research into ethics or into social science or political science? Also use resources. The iGEM website is a goldmine, like really. You can check wikis of previous teams. My colleague Tessa wrote this fantastic blog post of doing human practices during a global pandemic. If you haven't read it, read it, like read it. And we have a HP Resource Hub, read it, like really, really read it, study it. There's also information on the medal requirements, so you know what you're getting into. So really try to absorb everything you can to make sure you know what the competition expects from you, because everything is written out. There's no surprises. And I think that's it for my presentation. And okay, it wasn't 15 minutes, but we still have 35 minutes for questions, and I didn't see